trust in the mainstream media is declining, and it may be their own fault.
That's according to former star of The Office, Rainn Wilson, who sat down with MSNBC's Stephanie Ruhle on a recent episode of his podcast, Soave. Ruhle pointed the finger at figures like Steve Bannon and Elon Musk, saying they intentionally sow distrust and are among the many on the right that are working to replace traditional journalism with social media.
You had a bit of a perfect storm, right? President Trump won, and tons of people were shocked or angry or frustrated, and they're tuning out. And at the same time, you have the Elon Musk media machine, because they want you to leave traditional media and they want you to go to X, which is a bastion of misinformation where there is no fact checking.
But Wilson pushed back, putting the blame on mainstream news media for the apparent double standard and the aggressiveness of their coverage of the Biden administration. Take a listen.
I see this kind of insight and passion being directed at the current administration, and the lack of this kind of insight and passion being directed at the previous administration. Media organizations were kind of like, la, 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 everything's fine. Look, the economy's great, la, 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 immigration's not that much of a problem. And really being Cleopatra, queen of denial.
Yeah, I think Rainn Wilson raises some good points there, and Stephanie Ruhle is unsurprisingly completely clueless. Again, she made a false claim in that brief clip we played. She said they're going to social media where there's no fact-checking. That is just not the case. There's no gatekeeping. There's no one who comes and says, because that is a false claim, I will delete it from the internet. That's what she wants. She doesn't want correction. She wants censorship. She wants things that she doesn't agree with to not appear at all. That's the difference. Like, on X itself, the site we're talking about, I saw, for instance, that ivermectin is trending as a topic. Oh boy, uh-oh. So I click, and right, there's a tweet saying the FDA has now approved ivermectin for COVID 5 years and whatever later. Under that is a community note that says, this is false. The FDA has not authorized or approved ivermectin for use in preventing or treating COVID-19. So the idea that there is no fact-checking appearing on this website is just false. It's not true. So should she be taken off for having said a claim that was false? I mean, that's how ridiculous it is. These people get things wrong all the time, and there's never any, but I'm not saying, and thus you should lose your job, or you should be, or your speech should be deleted from the internet or from your show by some speech authority, but that seems to be what she wants.
Well, I think that you have to remember what the context of each show is, right? So when we're talking about traditional journalism, I think that's one thing. And then when you're talking about primetime programming or opinion programming analysis, that's another thing. And I think we need to differentiate those things.
It is increasingly hard to differentiate those things whatsoever.
Well, I think because we're bombarded with information, right? You have journalists who call themselves journalists just because they're on Twitter. And then Elon Musk, who runs Twitter, which obviously is a conflict of interest in many ways. And so that's what I think we're at, a place where podcasters are given information. People take that as law. And I think that all these mediums are important. They came about in the 90s when all these news networks came up to combat maybe what was thought of as a one-sided view. And it built up to today. But now we have so many voices in the pot that I think it's out of control, and people are taking everything as law. And that's, to me, up to the American public to decipher and figure out which sources they're going to vet, not just take only one situation and say that's law, that's final, because your favorite podcaster said it, or because it was a tweet, or even because it was on another network.
I would rather have too many voices than too few. And I think for a long time we had too few. And the problem you can have when you have too few is that a sort of consensus will form among like-minded, elite, credentialed, expert people that they get a lot of stuff right, but they do get stuff wrong as well. COVID, again, has been a really powerful example of that with, we can go into these things forever. We talk about them a lot on the show, but the idea that COVID could have come out of a lab being brutally and vigorously suppressed by the expert class, by mainstream media. It was suppressed on social media at the behest of the government. And that is a really clarifying and terrifying example for me, because now we don't know exactly what happened, but now the Energy Department, the CIA, and the FBI have all declared that that is the more likely explanation for COVID's origins. So much of what they said about how effective masks would be, social distancing, going outside, all of that guidance didn't fare exactly well over the long haul of time. That makes me more skeptical of centralizing narrative control in the hands of a small number of expert people when they got it so catastrophically wrong.
But it doesn't have to be a small number. I think you can spread your wings in your journalism, right? Start with the Hill and then move on from there. But you can have information, right, that you can digest and then go check with what the analysis or perspective of your favorite person on Twitter, on social media, on podcasts is. But I think what Americans have to do better is really have some discernment in what they're consuming. Because I've had too many conversations, and I know you probably can relate, with friends that just take a statement and repeat it to you, and then you have to correct them and say, oh, that's actually not the whole story. And so that's sometimes what we get also, is like part of the story. And that's why Americans are not trusting what they're saying in media, because we can't say that the host should be repeating any part of that. And sometimes on particular platforms, they might take a part to repeat and not the whole story. So what we have to do is then take what our favorite host, even in primetime programming, is saying and then go do our own homework. But there are institutions, which is why earlier I talked about protecting 60 Minutes, because there are places where you can get information of actual researchers and journalists, and they're presenting the story. Whether you think it's silly or not, they're presenting the story and providing information for you to then take and move on with it.
Right. I just think this happens in both media environments. I certainly think people should not take as gospel truth everything they hear some crank or contrarian person say on a podcast. We cover a lot of Joe Rogan episodes on Rising, and he's got a lot of guests I think are great that I totally agree with. He's got a lot of guests I think are really interesting, and I agree with some of the times, and I don't agree with others.
A lot of crazy
guests
ones
I think
too.
are totally insane. But assumptions that are false, I also see stated in mainstream media that go totally unchallenged. Or you're talking to people who know, who've listened to a podcast, and then they think they know everything about a subject and like are off base because that podcast didn't challenge the person. I agree with that. I've said there should be more challenging of guests in friendly podcast environments. But I also know people who will just recite things they've heard in mainstream media that have been disproven, and that they have no knowledge that they've been disproven. Like how popular, how enduring was the idea that and Sarah Palin finally sued the New York Times over this, but the idea but it's not contested. It was wrong, right? The idea that guy shot Gabby Giffords in Arizona was because he saw that Sarah Palin map that had targets over districts. Like that is, I still encounter people who think she shouldn't have done that, and that's what it has nothing to do with the shit. He never saw it. It's never been presented any information that they were connected whatsoever, which is why she sued the New York Times. But the very fine that Trump called the marching the Charleston neo-Nazi people very fine people. He said there were some very fine people on both sides of the issue of whether you should take down the statues. He did not say the Nazis that were marching are very fine people. Snopes has corrected this, but I still encounter people who have that wrongful impression from watching what the media said about it.
Well, I think it's important to correct yourself in both platforms, but what's the difference is that we're trusting podcasters like Joe Rogan, who usually don't correct their guests and have no disclaimer at the top of the show that says, hey, some of this might be lies, right? And then we're taking people on television. Their responsibility on TV is to say, hey, updated, corrected. I said this earlier. I wanted to clarify. New York Times in standard journalism practices is to put an asterisk updating the story at the bottom for any corrections that you need to add. And these are things that most people follow.
Oh, I can't
and I
even
think
begin
that that's
to tell you
important
how many
to
times
do.
I have caught mainstream media outlets time and time again doing what is called stealth edits, where I notice something that's wrong in the article and maybe I tweet about it or something, and then the next moment it's changed and there's no acknowledgement or correction. The Hill, which we work for, is a fantastic organization that does acknowledge corrections. I also write for the magazine Reason, that has a brutal for us people, if we get things wrong, corrections policy of like noting exactly what we did. I have caught other mainstream media outlets time and time again stealth editing and not acknowledging corrections, which I think is wrong.
Well, I think then everyone in the media space can get better at that, but also maybe there could be a little bit more oversight over podcasting all the information, just to say a disclaimer like Twitter does. This is just not true.
All right, that does it for us today on Rising. Thanks so much for tuning in, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.
Thanks for having me.
Yep, see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.